also have an introduction to make as well. And thank you to Stephanie for that introduction and for you all for inviting me here. This is one of my favorite venues of all time to talk to people who love illustrative art. So I do want to introduce you to a few folks today, and to begin with today, you're going to meet one of the most unusual heroes of World War II. And I have to admit that generally, when we think about heroes of World War II, we tend to think, sort of by default, of gentlemen like these. On your left, you see Audie Murphy, a Medal of Honor winner at age 19. He won that for holding off a company of Germans by himself, of German soldiers, and he launched a counterattack against that company. He was wounded when he did that, and he had no ammunition, and yet he did it anyway. And so he was quite a decorated hero for those folks back in the World War II era. On the right, you see Matt Urban, who was an officer, also a Medal of Honor winner, the winner of no less than 7 Purple Hearts. That's a lot of injuries to sustain in one war. And he actually was the most decorated U.S. soldier of World War II. So I wonder, when I think about these sorts of Medal of Honor winners, would it have been possible for them to win all those awards if they hadn't fired a shot? Well, at first glance, you would think not. But that hero that I want to introduce you to would say otherwise. So this is Desmond Doss, another hero from the World War II era, who was a Seventh-day Adventist and a war objector. But he was also patriotic, and he agreed to serve his country in the military as an unarmed medic. And he saved dozens of lives at Okinawa. And ironically, his story is being told right now in movie theaters. That's a Mel Gibson movie called Hacksaw Ridge. And it's mostly true to life. He was indeed a World War II era hero who never fired a weapon in anger. It's pretty remarkable. Medal of Honor winner. So he's probably unique, right? We generally think of heroes, at least wartime heroes, as firing in battle and so on. Or is it possible that there are other heroic soldiers from the war era who never fired weapons? Well, it depends on your definition of hero and of soldier, but today I want to introduce you to 2 further figures who would fit that definition. And I call them Willie and the Kid. The story of Willie and the Kid, move forward here, involves a homespun illustrator, an unknown copywriter, the demigod Hercules, a wartime romance, a legendary medieval knight, and an audience that would have made the Beatles sick with envy. All those elements will come into play in the story of these 2 figures. I call it Private Passion, Norman Rockwell, Willie Gillis, and American Obsession in World War II. And like all stories, we need to have a plot of sorts, so here's the plot that I have in mind. First of all, I want to dig a little bit more deeply into that notion of a hero. What are our definitions of what a hero might be, and do Willie and the Kid, who we'll meet a little bit later, actually fit that definition? In the second area, we will actually meet those 2 figures, and we'll dig a bit more deeply into their origin stories. And finally, we'll investigate their larger-than-life career in the war years, the heroic life. At the end, we'll hopefully have some time for any questions that you might have or discussion. And I'd say 45 minutes or so, we should be at the end. We'll begin with, what is a hero? What is a hero? Anyway, this is a question that a lot of folks have asked. Like so much in the Western world, we are under the influence of our Greek heritage of sorts, at least culturally. In the ancient world, the word heros would have been the word that you'd be looking at, one who protects us, one who prosecutes great feats, one who often has a hint of divinity. And your default example of a hero from that era, of course, would be Hercules. Among other feats, we are told, Hercules killed the eagle that was torturing Prometheus. Prometheus was the one who stole fire from the gods to give to humans, and so he was punished for that. So Hercules killed that eagle. Hercules also unchained the Titan himself. These are tremendous feats. Of course, he killed a lot of people in war, so maybe if they had had that back then, he would have also received a Medal of Honor, perhaps. You never know. But over the centuries, honor came to dominate the notion of being a hero. So moving forward just a little bit from the ancient version, we shift over to the idea of honor. In his book, The Mortal Hero, Seth Schein defines the hero as follows: the warrior who lives and dies in the pursuit of honor. So this is the medieval conception of the hero. And here you could be thinking about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table and Lancelot and Galahad and Excalibur. And one primary difference here from the classical version of a hero is that now anybody can be a hero. You can be a commoner and you can become virtuous and thus, as a part of that process, become a hero. As a classic example, we have the story of Roland, who was immortalized, and he was a real person, but much of what is said about him is probably not real, including an 11th century poem called The Song of Roland, in which he engages in brave deeds, as heroes do. He has a horn that's named Oliphant, and he has an unbreakable sword named Durendal. So all of these are probably signs of that hero. And he exemplified that sense of the medieval hero, virtues of loyalty, chivalry, courtesy, and bravery. And of course, it probably doesn't hurt if someone like this looks like a movie star, right? Probably a little easier to be heroic if you look like Heath Ledger, I suppose. Well, in recent years, our conception of hero has changed yet again. So Mark Twain, in one of his rare non-funny moments, had this to say: "We find not much in ourselves to admire, and we are always privately wanting to be like somebody else. If everybody were satisfied with himself, there would be no heroes." In other words, we're looking for that part of ourselves that might be missing, something that's deficient in ourselves, and heroes to help to fill that when we admire them. So when we say heroes today, we tend to think of someone who is inspirational, someone we'd like to be, someone we'd like to emulate in some way. Or as Merriam-Webster puts it, a hero is someone admired for their achievements or qualities. So how far have we come since Roland and since Hercules? Quite a ways. I wanted to offer you 4 current examples of groups, individuals rather, that I think would fit this modern day version of heroism. And you'll recognize a lot of these folks, I'm sure. Consider this unknown man who back in 1989 faced down a series of Chinese armored vehicles, tanks, as a way of preventing them from disrupting democracy demonstrations in Tiananmen Square. He later was hauled away, and as far as we know, he's never been heard from again. Certainly, to my mind, someone that I admire and find heroic in his deeds, even though we don't know his name. Or, a generation earlier, this woman, Rosa Parks, who in December 1955 ignored the orders of her bus driver in Montgomery, Alabama, and refused to give up her seat and move back to the so-called colored section of the bus. And of course, her actions ignited the Montgomery bus boycott. Again, heroic, someone that we find admirable. Or, more recently, September 11th, 2001, this man, Stephen Siller, a New York City firefighter, on 911 after hearing the news of the attack, found himself in Brooklyn, but wanted to do everything that he could to help. The tunnel over to Manhattan was already closed, and he was unable to drive through, so he donned 75 pounds worth of gear and ran through the tunnel to do everything that he could at the scene to help. He may have helped to save lives, we don't really know, because again, he was never heard from after that. Finally, a little bit more recently, as well as returning to the World War II theme, there is this woman. So this is Naomi Parker, now known as Naomi Fraley. Her face is very possibly, although it's not 100% sure, the very face peering out from this poster. Countless people admire her for her contributions during the war, as well as possibly being in this inspirational poster. And indeed, at the age of 95, she is a most inspirational figure indeed. As she recently said, "The women of this country these days need some icons. If they think I'm one, then I'm happy about that." So she understands, I think, what it means to have that idea of modern hero, that sense of being a hero. So here we are with all four of our individuals. Each of them has a devoted following, and for good reason. They are modern-day heroes. They inspire us. We admire them. In some ways, we want to be like them. And notice that none of them had to fire a weapon in anger. So the idea of the hero has changed over the years, all the way from the ancient world with Hercules to some of these more modern-day heroes. So let's go back then to the World War II era, where I do want to introduce you to both Willie and the kid, who I believe fit this mold, although in a slightly non-traditional way. They are greatly and widely admired, and yet they are not real people. Much like Hercules, who is mythic, or Roland, who was a real person, but the stories about him were generally mythic, they're not real people. So who were they? Well, to get to know these individuals, we have to jump into our time machines. So, are you ready? All right. We are going back to October 1941. So, what's going on in October 1941 here in the U.S.? A couple of ideas. The Maltese Falcon, starring Humphrey Bogart and Mary Astor, opens in New York City. The Yankees beat the Dodgers to win the World Series, 4-1. So they had a Subway Series with the New York teams that year. Chubby Checker is born in October 1941. Justice Louis Brandeis passes away. Archie Andrews and Betty Cooper have their debuts in Pep Comics. And Charles Lindbergh speaks to 20,000 people at an America First rally at Madison Square Garden. I guess they didn't realize the war was coming up so soon at that point. Well, that month, just over 75 years ago, the cover of the Saturday Evening Post featured a budding star. The Saturday Evening Post was one of the largest circulation magazines in the U.S. at that time. And on the October 4th issue, as Stephanie said, you can see one of the original covers right back there on the far right-hand side, second down from the bottom. We see Private Willie Gillis. We know his name from the package that he is carrying. The scene is giving us a humorous glimpse into the lighter side of Army life. Basic training at Fort Dix, New Jersey. The package from home says, "Food, no delay." And no less than 6 other GIs have detected there may be food from home in the offing, and they are stalking him, ready to relieve him of his newly found treasure. Well, it was a splashy introduction, and I have to think that a lot of folks in October 1941 found it very interesting, very humorous, perhaps. And in fact, the Cleveland News said that he had quickly become a kind of national hero. He somehow seemed to strike a chord with many Americans. In fact, he struck such a chord that Curtis Publications, the owner of the Saturday Evening Post, quickly got in touch with Rockwell and said, "We'd like a follow-up, please. We want to see this Willie character again." Rockwell loved the idea, and only 9 weeks later, and you can see on the back there, separated only by one cover in time, on November 29th, 1941, we saw another scene from Willie's life. Now Willie is home from boot camp, and speaking from experience, I know that when you come home from boot camp, that's exactly what you do. You sleep. You throw all of your gear on the floor. And indeed, his Army clothes are scattered all over the place. We still see his name, but we know that he is enjoying his well-deserved slumber. But it turns out that this is just weeks before the Pearl Harbor attack. And so only a few weeks later, Willie makes a third return engagement, and he's back in uniform and right into KP duty. So maybe not the most thrilling kind of service. By the end of 1942, however, Willie has returned a number of times, and U.S. forces are beginning to be introduced into action of their own in North Africa. And so Willie's adventures will only continue as Rockwell starts to see him increasingly involved in the war effort. So that's our introduction to Willie through the first year of his existence. Now, meanwhile, even as Willie is going through that first year at war, Americans in the home front are also going through their first year at war, and they're facing lots of problems. Now, there are too many problems to mention. I want to focus on one in particular, and that is transportation. So, gas is rationed, of course. New cars are not being manufactured. If you want new tires for your car, as we say back in New Jersey, forget about it. It's just not going to happen. And so you are either walking, you might be taking your bicycle, although again, if your tires go bad, you're not going to get new bicycle tires, or you're going to take the train wherever you're going. And so the train passenger service becomes a huge means of conveyance during the war. But the troops are using the trains as well. The Army and the Navy find that these are great ways to move troops from base to base within the U.S., as well as to embarkation points on the coasts. And so they become a huge choke point during the war. They are a nightmare of inefficiency and delays. And this is before TSA, right? Well, the National Archives has preserved hundreds of letters that were written to the Office of War Transportation complaining about the situation. And I want to share two of those with you, and I think you'll see that their tone is absolutely no different than a letter that somebody complaining today would be writing. So here's one from William Irvine, who did not write his return address, so I guess he didn't want to hear from them. He said, "On a recent trip of about 7,500 miles, I found the congestion that was caused principally from men in the surface, as well as federal employees who seem to spend a great deal of their time chasing around quite needlessly from place to place and doing more than their fair share to slow up the business of the country." I think I've sat by this person on the plane, right? It's the same tone that we have today. Or how about Albert Marshall of New Orleans? He wrote in to say, "It's taken me almost a week longer to make this trip than it used to. I realize that those of the administration have a tough job on their hands trying to please everyone in the country, but I think something should be done." So he was clearly tired of waiting for those trains, and the crowded trains once they arrived were even worse. But perhaps worst of all were reports that civilians were refusing to give up their seats to the servicemen who were embarking to the fronts. And so these servicemen had to stand all the way on the way to the battlefront. So what could be done about this problem? Well, the New Haven Railroad determined that it was going to do something. Now, the New Haven is a regional line. It's not around anymore, except in a historical sense. Some of their historical trains are still going. But it was a regional line that served New York City and nearby areas in New England. And they decided in the fall of 1942 to take this problem head on. And they hired an ad agency out of Boston to create a print ad. So their executives were fed up with the situation. Civilians were hoarding seats, as I said. GIs had to stand, and those civilians had the gall to complain. So who did they ask to help solve that problem? But this young and unknown copywriter, and unfortunately this is the best image I could find for him, named Nelson Metcalf Jr. So he's our unknown copywriter. And Metcalf took the problem seriously. He thought to himself, what can we do to try to convince people, civilians, that they should deal with this in a genial way and perhaps even give up their seats to those soldiers? So he came up with the idea of a narrative advertisement, a story about a soldier embarking for the war and being on the upper berth of a train as he thinks about his very life in a philosophical way. The artwork for the ad was done by Edwin Georgi, and I could not come up, as hard as I tried, of a picture of Georgi. So this was by Georgi, and it sort of represents my failure at finding an image of Georgi. So the museum may actually have a picture of him in the archives somewhere. So Sooner or later, maybe I'll get one. But if you look him up, all you see is his beautiful illustrations over the years. He was clearly very talented. So later on, he grew famous, but this is apparently one of his breakthrough pieces of work. Together, Georgie and Metcalf, the copywriter and the artist, produced this amazing advertisement of a brooding young GI headed off to the war front and thinking about his life. So this ad, the New Haven was dubious. They weren't sure if this was going to be successful. They agreed to spring, to give the money for this ad to appear in one newspaper, in the Herald Tribune out of New York City, and it was published the day before Thanksgiving, 1942. So they clearly didn't have a lot of hopes for it. They kind of put it out there and they said, you know, if it manages to get some attention, maybe we can do some more newspapers. But for the most part, they were uncertain that anything would happen. And they were wrong. It was an amazing and tremendous hit. The phone calls began coming on a Sunday at the New Haven Railroad, and they were coming in from all over the region. Rival railroads wanted to print this ad. They were so inspired by it. A few days later, folks from Washington began calling in, from the War Production Board and the U.S. Treasury. They wanted to know if this could be produced all over the country. And within a few weeks, indeed, this advertisement appeared across the country. Radio stations began to dramatize the text for their listeners. A popular song emerged that was played and became a hit. Fans began to write in to request copies of the original advertisement, and by 1943 it had won numerous awards. Indeed, today, ad historians routinely list this advertisement as one of the top 10 most influential advertisements of all times. The intent behind the ad, of course, is still clear, and you can see on the text here where Metcalf says this: to ask civilians to make room in a gracious way for GIs. Next time you're on the train, remember the kid in upper 4. If you have to stand en route, it's so he may have a seat. If there is no berth for you, it's so that he may sleep. If you have to wait for a seat that is in the diner, it is so that he and thousands like him may have a meal they won't forget in the days to come. So it was a very clear appeal, what it was trying to do, and remarkably it seems to have not only have been popular, but successful. A number of polls taken in the weeks and months after the ad appeared revealed that civilians' attitudes toward railroad overcrowding had begun to shift, and letters to newspapers shifted from complaints over to patriotic sentiments. And so it's one of those rare ads where you can draw a pretty clear line between the appeal and the probable effect of the appeal. Now, more to our point today, it's apparent that a new star had been born out of our advertisement. Americans were very admiring of this unnamed kid in upper 4. They wanted to know more about him. And so the signs of him being a hero and the definition that we established earlier are all there from the start. So to summarize this section, here we have two prominent print characters on the home front in World War II, Willie and the kid, and Americans have begun to openly admire them. So, what happens with them after that? Well, the story does continue as they live the heroic life. Now, is there anybody here who believes that Willie Gillis and the kid in upper 4 were actually real people? Don't raise your hands because they weren't. They were fictional. Okay. Similarly, I believe that most people on the home front really knew and understood that neither Willie nor the kid were actually real people. They understood that they were fictional. How could anyone deny that these two were inanimate drawings who were no more real than the piece of paper on which they were on? They couldn't breathe and they couldn't exist. And yet, despite that, what must have seemed obvious to everybody, there was a noticeable trend. People began to react to our two characters as if they were real, and they gradually became part of the nation's lore and culture. So I want to explore each of their heroic lives in turn. And we'll begin with Willie here in a later appearance. So his adventures begin to receive lots of adulation. And many of these letters, by the way, are preserved here at the archives, just behind the wall there. So after the very first cover, the first appearance of Willie, a sign of what was to come appeared in a very short letter to Rockwell that had this to say: "Congrats on the Willie Gillis character. More." And the "more" had an exclamation point after it, so it was rather demanding. Well, the Saturday Evening Post seemed to agree with this sentiment because not long after the first image was still in press, before it had actually gone out, the Post's art editor started to hector Rockwell, the artist. He wanted a second cover. So he wrote to Rockwell, who was in California at the time, "We can't let too much grass grow between the various pictures of this series." It was already a series in the art editor's mind. And Rockwell didn't reply. And how do you feel when someone doesn't reply to something like that? You feel a little frustrated? So the art director apparently felt frustrated because shortly after, he wrote a week later, "We are all hanging out of the window waiting for your new Willie Gillis cover. When will it arrive?" So they were getting desperate. They really wanted that second one to appear there so it could be put into print. Well, readers too had become obsessed very quickly with Willie. There is evidence that a number of young women during the war's early years cut out their favorite Willie cover and posted it in their bedrooms above their beds. He was a sort of a pinup. One of them, one of these young women, was named Natalie, I'm not sure I have her right name exactly correct, Barden, who would eventually meet a young man named Robert Buck, who was the real-life model for Willie Gillis. And they fell in love, and they eventually got married. So isn't that a neat romantic story? She had her husband, before she knew him, as a pinup, as Willie Gillis above her bed. So it was a fairy tale romance. Most fans, of course, never met Robert Buck, the model, in person, but it didn't seem to matter. They talked about Willie the same way as you would talk about an absent friend or a family member. And again, the records are preserved here at the museum. They said things like this: "He delights my soul. Best wishes, Mr. Rockwell, for a long career for Willie." One mother wrote in about this particular image and said that Willie in church looked lonely and homesick. She really felt bad for him. An Army corporal, also writing about this image, said, "My heart aches for Private Willie Gillis." But he was concerned not because Willie was lonely, but rather because Rockwell had made an error, at least according to the corporal. This is published in a July issue, but he's wearing winter issue gear. And so the letter went on to say, "Please, Mr. Rockwell, issue Willie a set of khakis for the duration of the summer." So they were obviously concerned in that way. Another group of military folks wrote Rockwell. These were Army Air Corpsmen out of Texas, and they asked if they could host the original painting, the one that's upstairs, at their base in Texas. They had this to say: "Willie and his hungry pals will receive the very best of treatment and attention if they're sent to live with us. We'd almost promised to make Willie as tough a soldier man as that grim-faced plug ugly at his right elbow." So there's no telling how serious these folks were, I suppose, but again, you have this sense that they're talking about these characters as if they have a life outside of the canvas. But there were more folks who wrote in. Some people claimed, or seemed to claim, that they knew Willie personally. So one couple wrote in to say, "Willie Gillis tells me to introduce myself and to say how much I enjoy and appreciate your pictures." Yeah, this person met Willie Gillis, told them to write to Rockwell and say how great an artist he was. Perhaps even eerier, Marjorie and Eric Dixon of Wheaton, Illinois, seemed to believe that Willie himself had hitchhiked with them throughout Texas and Oklahoma. And they wanted to Rockwell to know about this, so they wrote him and they said, "You know what? He's as friendly as a puppy." So yeah, I guess he's real. So they, like so many other people on the home front, seem to have accepted that Willie had a sort of real life out there in the real world. As one correspondent summarized, who is he? For such an engaging boy must be somebody, not just somebody. So they seem to think that he was real in some ways. So this is, again, the hallmark of a sort of a heroic life. They're imputing a real life, and they're admiring these folks for their qualities. What about the kid? Well, the kid had a similar career of awareness with those on the home front. And indeed, he too came back regularly on the home front. Throughout 1943, in fact, his initial appearance had become so popular that the railroad was asked to do additional ads featuring scenes from his budding career. And so a follow-up ad was called The Kid on the Convoy. And then we have The Kid in His Letter. You want to see these here. And then we have The Kid Takes Over. Now, I have brought with me here some old magazines, and they're bound, and they're so kind of a little too heavy to pass around, but you're welcome to take a look here. So in Newsweek, 1943, I have The Kid Takes Over. That's in the blue volume. That's the last of the series. And on the right-hand side is, I believe, Time magazine, also 1943, The Kid in His Letter. And you can see that there's an update in his story, but also in terms of the pictures, we see him advancing in his career as he gets closer and closer to the battlefronts. And ultimately, with the last one, he has a refugee in his hand. And he's actually very similar to a Christ-like figure in his sense of redemption, I suppose. By 1944, over 100,000 requests had come in from the American public asking for reprints of these various ads. And so the New Haven almost became a printing company for a while instead of running the railroad. It was so popular that the movie industry began to take notice as well. In 1944, MGM Productions created a movie short, an 11-minute movie. Here's our poster here, predictably called The Kid in Upper 4. And again, we see that lasting connection with Americans taking place. As the New York Herald Tribune, which was the newspaper where he first appeared back in 1942, summarized, because they were kind of proud that he had his debut in their newspaper, more than any other advertisement published in this war, perhaps even this generation, this one has been read and reread and believed and answered by an understanding public. Or back in 1945, and think about that, this is 3 years later. Can you think of any ads that you saw 3 years ago that you're still talking about? Perhaps not. So in 1945, Freeman Hubbard writes in a book about the railroad industry, "The universal quality of the kid in Upper 4 strikes you instantly and deeply. Dull indeed is the human being who would fail to be moved by such an appeal. He is your son and mine, your brother and mine." So again, he stepped off the canvas. He's developing a real life in and of himself. Keep in mind, this is a print character. We've never seen him outside of the pages or on a movie screen, and yet we're treating him as a real person. And the correspondence seems to indicate this. Now, these letters were preserved at the archive in St. Louis, which is kept, actually, no, this is at the University of Connecticut, which has some of the railroad papers. So some examples. Mrs. Albert Dacey of Hyde Park, Massachusetts, wrote in to say, "Whoever wrote that piece must have watched that kid as I did, close the front door, look back and wave, and then he was gone. But the character was as real as could be. You see, I know that kid. I'm his mother." It really struck her. Or Mr. and Mrs. Edward Brown of East Moline, Illinois. "The kid in Upper 4 belongs to us. It is for us he is fighting, and we are standing by and standing up for him 100%. The MGM short brought out these feelings even more poignantly. There's a narrator in the short, and unfortunately the short itself has been lost. All we have left is the script, so it burned up or it just was not preserved for whatever reason. But according to the script, the narrator had this to say toward the end, addressing the kids specifically. "You are bringing new hope and peace and freedom for a tired, bleeding world. So long, kid. We'll be waiting." Brings a lump to your throat, right? So a number of Americans, as you can see, in their admiration for this paper-based and briefly movie-based characters, seem to be treating him as a real person. As the May 1945 New York Times editorial put it, remember the kid in Upper 4? He thinks about you, his home folks, even under the murderous fire of enemy machine gunners. Much like Willie, Rockwell's character, he had become widely admired. He was a sort of hero for those folks on the home front. They weren't Medal of Honor winners, it's true, but their impact on the culture of the home front was surely much greater and probably longer lasting than many other Medal of Honor winners. So they were bona fide American heroes. It was a status that in many ways was rather rare. Just to give you a quick contrast at the end here, here we see another soldier from the Saturday Evening Post cover, this one painted by Meade Schaefer in 1944. People did briefly admire this image, but you saw nowhere near the adulation that either the kid or that Willie received. Well, part of the difference may have been that both the kid and Willie came back repeatedly. This unnamed soldier only was there just the once. But for whatever reason it was, our two heroes were treated in a very special way. Either way, they were American heroes whose influence was as real as Hercules and as inspiring as that of Roland. So, my goal today has been to look at these two characters, to introduce you to them, and hope to convince you, at least in the case of the one on the left here, that with our 75th anniversary, and I guess it's the 74th anniversary for the kid, that they're worthy of remembering as a kind of American hero. So, while it's true that we may not want to judge a book by its cover, perhaps we can judge a magazine by its cover, and that can give you an idea of how important the character on there will be for the home front. So I'll end with that and see if you have any questions or discussion.